My name is Baldwin Pedraza. I'm the Director of Student Services here in Garden Grove, and I'd like to welcome our guest to our presentation. And our titled presentation, Cause and Effect, Tobacco, Substances, and Restorative Justice for At-Promise Youth. We have our presenters from the LGBTQ Center of Orange County, and we're very ecstatic to have them here. We have Tobias Vasquez, Hannah Brininger, and Ali Chen, who will be leading us through the presentation today.
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Tobias Vasquez. My pronouns are they, he, and I am the health navigator with the Center OC. I'll pass it to my colleague Hannah.
Hello everyone, my name is Hannah Brininger. I'm a youth program assistant at the Center OC, and my pronouns are they, she. I'll pass it over to Ellie.
Hey everyone, my name is Ali and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the youth program coordinator at the center. And I will give it back to Tobias.
Awesome. So next slide, please. Awesome. So we're with the LGBTQ Center in Orange County. Our mission is to advocate on behalf of Orange County's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer and questioning communities and provide services to ensure our well-being and positive identity. We have a number of programs and services listed here below, including youth programs, including mental health, tobacco cessation, sexual health, linkages to care for trans people, advocacy for immigration, and then just overall advocacy and education here in Orange County as well. You can go to the next slide. So our presentation objectives, I think for the sake of time, I'm just gonna kind of quickly summarize this. And basically what we're doing is we're gonna be providing information on the cause and effect, right? Like what some reasons are why LGBTQ youth turn to substance use, including tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs, and what are some possible solutions, including restorative justice, which we will get into. You can go to the next slide. So for at-promise youth, we wanted to kind of reconceptualize, right, the term at-risk to at-promise. And this is actually something that a California bill stipulates as of very recently in the last decade, the last 5 years, I believe. I think this was 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And so basically what they're doing now is they're switching the language from at-risk to at-promise without changing the definition to destigmatize, right, that concept of at-risk youth and really highlighting the potential of all these young people, right, when given the necessary and right resources of their ability to thrive in school and in life. And so we believe that all these youth, right, that are considered at promise, right, deserve and have an immense amount of potential. And so our work is dedicated to supporting and uplifting those youth, their families, and their communities. Next slide, please. So we're gonna go into a little bit about some of the causes, right? So for LGBTQ youth disparities, just kind of a precursor, we see that statistically, LGBTQ youth and young adults have higher rates of mental health issues, substance use rates, and also discrimination than their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts. And this can and does look different throughout the spectrum of LGBTQI folks. It looks different for youth of color, for rural youth, for trans youth as well. And we even see that there's differences between bisexual, lesbian, and gay identifying youth as well. We also want to acknowledge that, right, a lot of these occurrences or causes also have to do with our societal and cultural norms, as well as institutional and legal barriers that predate most of us, right, since any of us were born, right? And so we want to acknowledge that we are born into these systems, and part of our work is also to demystify and unlearn some of these norms that we were born into. Next slide, please. So this is going to be national data on LGBTQ youth. This was taken from a 2017 report by the Human Rights Campaign, in which they surveyed LGBTQI youth ages 13 to 17 nationally. And so we're going to take a look at some of the numbers here. For disparities at home, they noticed that more than half of these youth said that they were out to their immediate family. So about half is not out to their family, right? A third of LGBTQ say that their family is not accepting of LGBTQ people. Next slide, please. Less than a third of these youth said that their family is a place where they hear positive messages about being LGBTQ. So about a third said that their family is not supportive, and a third said that their family is supportive, right? About half of LGBTQ youth said that they do have a trusting adult that they could turn to, compared to 79% of non-LGBTQ youth who did say that they have a trusting adult. Next slide, please. For school, instead of reading through all of these stats, I'll just summarize it in that LGBTQ youth are twice as likely than non-LGBTQ youth to be bullied verbally, physically, and also to be excluded socially by their peers. This is nationally. And then, of course, again, the national rate of LGBTQ youth smoking and tobacco use is also seen as double the rate of heterosexual students. And even for transgender youth, it's noted to be even higher. And we're going to note right here and really drive the point that discrimination and stressors really correlates with smoking, with higher rates of smoking, as we've seen in studies, and also more risky behavior. So, and we also see that on the inverse, that having supportive communities and having that support system correlates to less risk of smoking and less risk of engaging in those behaviors, right? So if we can go to the next slide. This is going to be specific data on Orange County LGBTQI youth taken from the 2015 California Healthy Kids Survey. This data was aggregated and compiled by folks at Chapman University, as well as the ACLU of Southern California. And so let's take a look at some of these numbers. So for the reporting period of this, for school attendance, they noted that LGB youth, lesbian, gay, bisexual youth, were almost four times more likely than their non-LGB peers to miss school in the last 30 days because of feelings of safe or not being safe. For trans youth, they noticed that this was 8 times more likely that they were to miss school than their non-transgender peers for the same reason. We can go to the next slide. For bullying, we noticed that trans youth were more likely to report having been bullied, harassed physically at least one or more time on school than their non-transgender peers. 36 trans youth is the rate, and then 19% is the non-trans youth rate. And so LGBT youth, we saw similarly 29% versus 19% of bullying. For alcohol and substance use, we saw a lifetime use of alcohol and marijuana as well being higher for LGBT and trans youth compared to their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts. And so instead of going through the numbers specifically, we're just going to keep it rolling. And if you want to know more about the numbers, we can definitely connect with you afterwards. Can you go to the next slide? For mental health as well, we did notice that 45% of LGBT youth reported having seriously considered suicide compared to 13% of their non-LGBT peers. And then similarly, 49% of trans youth considered this as compared to 15% of non-trans youth. In terms of approximate numbers in Orange County, this accounts for about 7,000, a little bit over, middle and high school aged LGBT youth having seriously considered suicide. Next slide, please. And so to kind of move away from those grim stats, we also really want to highlight these studies as well that show protective factors for LGBTQI youth. And so, right, we know that young people have a lot of resiliency, they're at promise, they have a lot of potential, but it's really important to note that for LGBTQI youth, these like 4 pillars are super important in terms of them being able to thrive in school and in life. So social support, right? Do they have good relationships with their peers, with their family, with their trusted adults around them? And then being able to share and confide in those folks, right? And having a community of like-minded folks. Role models, do they have access to role models, whether it's in the media or it's in person, about what it means to be an LGBTQ person? Their environment, do they have a stable and supportive environment at school? Are there anti-bullying policies in place and practices at school? Can they use their chosen name, and can they use their pronouns and the facilities that corresponds with their gender identity? Do they hear disparaging remarks at home about LGBTQ people? So their environment, right? And then coping with coming out, do they have support and access and resources in navigating their coming out, right? For LGBTQ folks, we say that coming out is not a linear or a singular process. We are coming out constantly to different people at work, at school, at home, in different circles. So being able to navigate that is really important, and having support for that is really important as a young person. Next slide, please. So particularly for LGBTQI youth and adult tobacco use, which is the field that I'm concentrating on right now, we're going to go into a little bit of some of these numbers. Can go to the next slide. For LGBTQ youth cigarette use in particular, we do see that the smoking prevalence is twice as high according to a report on Tobacco Free California. This is for California youth. Excuse me, 4% of LGBTQ youth reported cigarette smoking prevalence compared to 2% of the general youth. And then when we looked at tobacco use overall, it was 15% LGBTQ youth and 12.7% of the general youth population. With cannabis use, we saw that similarly, we saw 20% of LGBTQ youth reported using cannabis, and then 14.7% of the general youth population using cannabis. So we are seeing a consistent trend that these LGBTQI youth are using cigarettes and tobacco products and even cannabis and even alcohol, right, at higher rates than their non-LGBTQ counterparts. Next slide, please. And so many of these reports also noted that although the smoking and the cigarette use rate is going down overall, that the disparities still are consistent, right? Even though the smoking prevalence is going down overall, LGBTQ youth still tend to use those products at a higher rate than their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. We also noticed that for the different people in the different spectrum, right? So LGBT students right here did smoke more frequently, and then even for lesbian and bisexual girls in the study were 9.7 times more likely to smoke those cigarettes on the daily compared to their heterosexual counterparts. Next slide, please. And so for vaping, we've noticed in the research and the literature that while smoking cigarettes has kind of gone down a bit, vaping and e-cigarette use has really, really skyrocketed, and for a number of different reasons. Number one and number two on the left kind of show just a picture of the youth vaping rate in general. And so there is an increase according to these studies. And then when we look at LGBTQ youth and their vaping rates, we do see that it is impacting them just in a disproportional rate, with 3 in 10 LGBTQ youth currently vaping and more than half having tried e-cigarettes. And so some of the reasons that they ask some of these youth, like, why are you using these products, right? Why are you vaping? And the more consistent responses that they got were curiosity, the flavoring, right? The taste of it, and then the low perceived harm compared to other tobacco products, i.e. probably cigarettes, right? And then so the Juul pod is one of the more popular, one of the most potent in nicotine volume for these e-cigarettes. And then most youth just kind of think it's flavor. There's not a lot of education in like the harms of vaping, and it's still widely perceived as like a safer option for cigarette smoking, which is not the case. Yes, thank you. And so this is just a snippet of, these are all vaping products. And so as you can see, some look like watches, some look like inhalers, funnily enough, some look like car keys and USB drives. And so this isn't to get young people in trouble. This is more so to get people aware of how tobacco industries are marketing and designing their products to be covert, right? So next slide, please. In terms of LGBTQ adult tobacco use rates, we see again consistently, because right, young people become adults someday, that those adults take on those habits that they got as young people. And we see that the adult tobacco rates of LGBTQ people is also consistently double the rate of cisgender and heterosexual counterparts as well. And then for transgender folks as well, there is some data out there, but we definitely could use more data of like the particular smoking rates and habits of transgender people. And we also know that transgender people overall are more vulnerable to higher rates of abuse, depression, mental illness, discrimination, and other associated things that correlate with higher smoking rates. Again, we see bisexual women are also 3.5 times more likely to smoke and to try their first cigarette at a younger age, and to have nicotine dependence compared to heterosexual women. And we also see that LGBTQ smokers tend to smoke menthols more, which also is one of the menthol is one of the most prevalent flavors of tobacco and smoking that also the Black community tends to gravitate towards too, and there's a whole history on it. But basically, with that being said, Big Tobacco knows this. They know that Black folks and LGBT folks like flavors and they like menthol. And so when it comes to a lot of the policy work that's being done, Big Tobacco lobbies hard. They lobby really hard to make sure that their menthol and flavor products are exempted from any sort of bans that tobacco control advocates try to push at the legislature. Can we go to the next slide, please? So yeah, big tobacco, right? We in the work that we're doing, we really try to highlight this, that big tobacco is not kind of just like an innocent bystander, just like innocently selling their products. They spend millions upon billions of dollars in marketing, and they have for so many years. There's this a marketing tactic called Project Scum. Subculture urban marketing is what it stands for, that targeted the urban kind of counterculture youth in San Francisco back in the 1990s. And this included LGBTQ youth. It included like Black folks, urban folks, folks of color, Latinos, so on and so forth. And so this has been going on for a very long time, right? They also support and sponsor different events. They give money to pride festivals and agencies to be able to have that connection still, to be able to give and find, for their products to find a way into our hands, basically, and into the hands of our young people as well. And so this is something that we definitely, at the center, we advocate against, and we definitely advocate and don't take any money from big tobacco companies. Can we go to the next slide? So yeah, the dangers and effects of tobacco use, as we all know, it's very unhealthy. And it leads to cancer. It's like the #1 most preventable form of death that happens here in the United States. It definitely, how can I say this? It definitely causes a huge death rate for Black folks, for LGBTQI folks. And so it's killing about 30,000 LGBTQ people per year. When it comes to folks in the community, like why folks in the community should care, if they're transgender, if their loved ones are transgender, if they're going through surgery and they're smoking, there's a higher chance of that surgery being botched. There's a higher chance of getting blood clots. There's a higher chance of like the aesthetics of the surgery not to be well because of the smoking, right? Of the effects of smoking, and that includes surgeries. That includes people who are living with HIV. It shortens their lifespan, and also we tend to see that LGBTQI folks and folks who smoke are also likely to abuse and be dependent on other substances as well. Next slide, please. And so for prevention, what we really try to do at the center is we do a lot of community education, and we do a lot of targeted messaging to our folks to show them that there are alternatives, to show them that we can be healthy and thriving and cool and awesome and amazing without smoking. In terms of advocacy, we also support the ban of e-cigarettes to minors and flavors. We support flavor bans. We support taxation policies, and we also try to educate youth as much as possible. In terms of maybe parents and educators and administrators, what we suggest is having alternatives to punishment for using these products. And so that, I know that goes a little bit more into the specific protocols at schools and whatnot, but if it's possible, right, using those alternatives, counseling, treatment, and also going back to those protective factors, like really ensuring that these young people, and really all young people, right, that young people have that strong support system, and that we're really supporting that social and emotional learning and well-being that we see protects a lot of youth from these risky behaviors. Next slide, please. So resources for tobacco cessation and advocacy, two resources that we'd like to share, one being the advocacy coalition that we're developing at the center with youth and young adults. We are developing this group of very passionate individuals here in Orange County who want to promote like healthier lifestyles for their communities, where we support them in learning more advocacy skills and building relationships with each other. And so that's open to youth and young adults here all over Orange County. They don't have to be LGBTQI. They just want to, they just got to be passionate about doing advocacy, right, and bettering our public health. And then we have the tobacco cessation program that we just launched. And so we are now connecting LGBTQ and allied folks in Orange County to smoking cessation hotlines, in which they will get professional support, reminders, either through text or through phone call, helping them and walking these people through their quitting journey. So we have the link down there below, and I will copy and paste those links in the chat box as well for any folks who are curious about that, along with my email. If you have any questions about anything that I just talked about. And that does it for me. Thank you so much. I will pass it on to my colleague, Hannah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hannah, and I'm here to talk about the detrimental effects that zero tolerance policies and hostile school climates can have on at-promise youth. So zero tolerance policies refer to school discipline policies and practices which mandate predetermined consequences. They're usually severe, punitive, and exclusionary, for example, out of school suspension or expulsion, and in response to specific types of student misbehavior, regardless of the context or rationale for the student's behavior. And the term originated during the Reagan era, during which the Federal Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was signed into law as a response to the war on drugs. That law imposed new mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders, which changed a rehabilitative system into more of a punitive system. And as a result, zero tolerance policies create an unwelcome, high pressure environment for students. Those students who are found with substances do not get a chance to have their story heard. And it also isolates students who are affected by these policies. They're barred from school and also abandoned in a sense. It's difficult to find rehab or other rehabilitation resources without school support. And hostile school climate's effects on students. Zero tolerance policies often result in students being driven toward the school to prison pipeline. Essentially, once a student is disciplined in the form of zero tolerance policy that criminalizes and isolates them, they're also driven away from their peers and into the criminal justice system. And the school to prison pipeline is essentially a cycle that at-promise youth and LGBTQ youth are often more affected by, where once they're arrested or otherwise disciplined in a way that involves law enforcement on their school campus, it becomes difficult to escape that cycle of reoffending as certain resources are taken away and they're driven further into the prison system. And as you can see, youth of color are often more likely to lose instruction days due to suspension compared to white youth, with Black and American Indian Alaska Native youth being targets of school discipline through suspension most frequently. And as this chart shows, school arrests for girls as well as boys with disabilities are much higher among Black, Native American, Latinx, and Pacific Islander populations compared to white students. And this data is similar to the previous slide, but shows the racial disparity more clearly. According to the ACLU, Latinx, Native American, and Black girls, as well as boys with disabilities, are arrested and referred to law enforcement within their schools at significantly higher rates. And some data on substance use. LGBTQ adolescents are at an increased risk to both experimental and heavy substance use. Some of the factors that put LGBTQ adolescents at high risk are their exposure to high levels of stress due to their sexual orientation and/or identity, as well as discrimination that they experience. About 2.2 million adolescents aged 12 to 17 in 2018 drank alcohol in the past month, and about 1.2 million of those adolescents binge drank during that period. As well, data from the 2018 NSDUH reports that 58.8 million people were current as in the past month tobacco users. And specifically, 47 million of people aged 12 or older in 2018 had smoked cigarettes in the past month. Data from the CDC's 2018 National Youth Tobacco Survey indicates that there was a 78% increase in current e-cigarette use among high school students and a 49% increase among middle school students from 2017 to 2018. As well, in 2018, there were 10.3 million people ages 12 or older who misused opioids in the past year, and the vast majority of those people were misusing prescription pain relievers. And about 2 million people ages 12 or older had an opioid use disorder based on 2018 NSDUH data. So LGBTQ youth have 1.3 times the odds of heavy alcohol use, 1.6 times the odds of marijuana use, and 2.9 times the odds of injection drug use, as well as 3.3 times the cocaine use compared to their straight counterparts. As well, several studies have found that LGBTQ students who are victimized in school have higher rates of drug and alcohol use than their heterosexual peers. And LGBTQ teens may be twice as likely to be bullied, excluded, or assaulted at school. They're also 40% less likely to have an adult in their family who they could turn to, as Tobias stated earlier. And substance abuse among transgender teens is much less known about, as a lot of research studies fail to identify trans participants. Transgender folks experience substance abuse risk factors like peer victimization and psychological distress at an even higher level than most lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer youth who are cisgender. And why do students abuse substances? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. A few of these include social stigma for LGBTQ students, bullying and harassment, minority stress, and abuse at home. And unfortunately, sometimes the hostility becomes so severe that youth resort to running away from home. Up to 40% of unaccompanied homeless youth are LGBTQ. And the center's approach to this is our new substance abuse prevention program called Elevate. Our Youth Empowered to Act group is a social justice and advocacy coalition dedicated to uplifting LGBTQ+ and BIPOC identities. And the new program Elevate that we're implementing within this group aims to correct the imbalance of criminal punishment in Orange County school districts by replacing it with a more sustainable alternative, which is restorative justice practices. And I will let my coworker Allie talk more about that.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. My name is Allie, and today I'm here to introduce restorative justice as an effective way to bring about positive change into your school. Next slide, please. So restorative justice is a more compassionate and humane approach to resolving crimes and wrongdoings, and it originates from Indigenous peacemaking practices. It focuses on repairing damage and rebuilding relationships, and it revolves around understanding the root of the issue at hand from the perspectives of everyone involved and everyone impacted. And this then allows folks to see how their actions affect others. Restorative justice isn't the solution per se, because the solution is up to whether or not the people involved are willing to engage in resolving it. Rather, restorative justice is a means of guiding folks to recognizing underlying causes of misbehavior, which then empowers them to enter conversations of resolution from a more informed and empathetic standpoint. This promotes long-lasting solutions and significantly decreases chances of repeated offenses. Next slide, please. So restorative in schools, it looks like 3 different tiers. The first tier being prevention, and that looks like establishing strong relationships through classroom respect agreements. So teachers will incorporate the input of students when establishing ground rules, and this promotes respect, accountability, as well as ownership. It also looks like community building, so facilitating circles of sharing, and this allows students to be open and vulnerable, and it then promotes building trust and teaches students to be emotionally expressive. This together will eliminate some behavior issues before they even start, de-escalate others, and equip more students and teachers with the capacity to handle conflict restoratively. The second tier is mediation and intervention. So when students do engage in misconduct, it's about having students take accountability of their actions. So having the offender student sit down with the offended student, and together they have an open conversation about why they did what they did and how their actions impacted the other. And through this, it's like held in a non-judgmental way, and this promotes restorative solutions. And through it, you're building and repairing relationships, and sometimes a pre-charge diversion program is implemented so that when they figure out a plan to fix the solution, if the student does fix the solution, they won't be charged, they won't be pushed into juvie, or they won't be pushed into the criminal justice system. So this gives them a second chance. And then the third tier is all about reintegration. So when students get pulled out via detention, expulsion, suspension, like they're given a way to reintegrate into the classroom. So it includes things like counseling, therapy, tutoring, and additional resources. Next slide, please.
Really quick, Allie, I just want to remind our guests, please feel free to put questions in the chat box and our presenters will address them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Baldwin. Okay, so very quickly, the common challenges of restorative justice, very high level, is that you can't force students to partake in restorative practices. They have to be very open and willing to engage in it. Otherwise, it could serve more harm than good. And if you're experiencing a lot of pushback on this, it's an indicator that more community building work is needed. And if it's like a bullying situation, for example, a solution to that is to have individual circles for each of them instead of like having them sit together in one restorative circle. It's you can just pull them apart and have individual circles for each of them. Next slide, please. So restorative justice and creating space for LGBTQ students. It's crucial to consider the intersectional experiences of LGBTQ students who are students of color and students with disabilities, because they additionally face the impacts of discriminatory policies and explicit and implicit biases in school discipline practices. Next slide, please. So you're probably wondering, like, for the schools that have implemented restorative justice alternatives and practices, what does it look like? How has it impacted them? And there are a lot of slides, or there are a lot of statistics in the next 6 slides, but I will kind of just glean over them and give you the summary of it. And so next slide, please. So one aspect of it is student misbehavior and social discipline. Essentially, you'll see in all of these different school districts that there is a drop in suspension rates, there is a drop in assaults on both teachers and students, drop in disorderly conduct and classroom disruption, as well as like disrespect to teachers. All of that, it decreases. Next slide, please. Impacts on bullying. So overall, we see a lower level of bullying, and that includes cyberbullying, physical bullying, emotional bullying. And you'll see on the flip side, there are higher levels of peer attachment, peer relationships, school connectedness, and empathy. Next slide, please. In terms of racial disparities in discipline, we see that restorative practices do narrow the racial disparity gap. And while it's not eradicated per se, it is like considerably lowered. And that affects like, you know, Black students, like all these students groups, including Black, Latinx, Asian, white students, students with disabilities, English learner students, and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Next slide, please. In terms of attendance, restorative justice practices all across the board do lead to improved school attendance, and it decreases absenteeism. Next slide, please. And then in terms of school climate and safety, it is significantly improved in terms of like how teachers perceive their working conditions being conducive to teaching and learning. And then also there are like higher levels of school connectedness, positive peer relations, and peer attachment. And you'll see that again, like all across the different school districts that they implemented in. Next slide, please. And all of that does indirectly lead to a higher academic outcome. So for example, in Oakland and San Antonio, you'll see like a much greater increase in academic performance. And so throughout all of those statistics in all 6 different areas, it does contribute to better protective factors in terms of like supportive social circles as well as environmental support. And that then feeds into a healthier student life, which then leads to happier students who don't have as much trauma or conflict experience in their school life. And that means that they don't necessarily have like more, they aren't looking for coping mechanisms because they have less trauma that they're experiencing. And so that then leads to less drug usage because a coping mechanism of choice is drug usage. So that's how it all ties together. Next slide, please. So then how do you leverage restorative justice in the context of substance abuse? First step is to shift your mindset and reframe substance abuse as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. And you approach this by implementing group sessions, digging into the root of the issues, and then providing services like rehabilitation programs, as well as therapy, counseling, tutoring, and then after all of that, it's also about providing post-treatment support. Next slide, please. So how can you help? You can help as different types of, at different levels. So you can help at the student or youth level, or you can help at the parent or community member level, or even as a teacher or as a principal / school administrator. Next slide, please. So as a youth or student, you can contribute to restorative culture on your campus by embodying respect, non-judgment, inclusivity, vulnerability, and open-mindedness. And all of this, by putting it out there, you are setting an example for your peers to follow suit. You can also help fill out school climate surveys from orgs, and this helps them to gauge your school climate and then assess the areas of improvement that are needed. You can also assess your school in terms of like have they implemented comprehensive and inclusive policies. If they have, that's great, but if they haven't, you can advocate for restorative alternatives to zero tolerance policies, and you can fight for evidence-based supportive services on campus, and you can educate your peers regarding the school to prison pipeline, the war on drugs, and the racial and social disparities. If this sounds like a lot, it is a lot, but you're not alone. And if you're really into social justice and you want to take it a step further, you can feel free to join our Elevate program, which I'll talk about in the slide after the next. It's essentially a social justice coalition youth group full of very passionate folks who are very invested in this effort. Next slide, please. So a real life example of how some students in Pomona Student Union in the Pomona Unified School District have contributed to this effort in their own unique way. Essentially, they reviewed kind of like the financial statement of their school district to assess like how the funds, the state grant funds are being used. And they found that the funds that were meant for high needs students, they were being spent on law enforcement on campuses, which is considered illegal by the laws of the grant, by the rules of the grant, because when you're funding law enforcement, that is not necessarily increasing or improving services for high needs student groups. So this, these students then like mobilized their community to fight to have that reversed. And then the result of that, next slide, please, is that they successfully got $2,156,210 divested from law enforcement and then reinvested into additional school counselors, which is, the counselors are actually an evidence-based student supportive aspect. So that was a huge win. Next slide, please. So if you are interested in this type of advocacy work, you can join the Elevate program, where we do explore all of this in depth. And we meet every Thursday from 5 to 7 p.m. And I'll drop the registration link in the chat. Next slide, please. So how can you help as a parent or community member? You can approach substance using youth with non-judgment and open-mindedness, because this then gives them a safe space to open up. And you can try to find the root of the issue by listening to the youth rather than projecting your own thoughts onto them or by making assumptions. And then it's also important to recognize that in this kind of, with this kind of topic, relapses may occur. So you have to navigate situations with empathy and understanding in order to further build trust. And it's also about guiding youth to resources, showing up for and supporting students who are engaged in advocacy work and community organizing, and speaking up at school board meetings and district meetings when you can. And if you, again, want to take it a step further, you can join a coalition of parents, teachers, and community members who are committed to this advocacy work. And it's called Youth First OC. And I'll drop the link in the chat if you would like to register for that. And it's also about making time to attend restorative conferences or circles or group sessions if your child brings that up. Next slide, please. So how can you help as a teacher? You can create a classroom respect agreement with students at the beginning of the year. So instead of projecting like forcing your students to abide by your rules. It's about bringing them into the conversation when you're creating the rules. And this again promotes accountability and ownership and harmony in the classroom. And then it's also about a daily commitment to relationship building. So encouraging openness, transparency, respect, and support, and being non-judgmental in the way you ask things, and then understanding the underlying root of the issue rather than making assumptions. It's also about understanding your own subconscious biases and how it can play a role in the way you operate in the classroom. It's also about helping to push for policy level change in schools, and Youth First OC is something that you can join as well. Next slide, please.
Just to let you know, Ali, we have 4 minutes.
For sure, thank you. So Youth First OC, again, is a coalition of youth and students and parents, families, teachers, school administrators, really anyone in the community who wants to stand up for and support youth. So they meet every third Wednesdays of the month from 6 to 8 p.m. and the link is in the chat to register. Next slide, please. So how can you help as a principal or school administrator? There are so many ways. Okay, one of them, understanding the root of the issue. You can help to push for counseling, therapy, rehabilitation programs, all of that in a trauma-informed and culturally competent way. You can invest in evidence-based resources that benefit students. So that includes, hiring more counselors, more nurses, psychologists, social workers. You can increase the funding for bilingual mental health clinicians, and you can divest in on-campus law enforcement. It's also about providing alternative educational and interactive activities or programs or services in place of these zero tolerance suspensions and expulsions. Also, another way is to develop compassionate, empathetic educators, staff, and admin. So that you can achieve that through mandated comprehensive trainings, also training your community safety officers. And then you can also provide services for students who have been pushed out through like zero tolerance policies. So you can provide them with tutoring services to catch them up on homework and classwork. You can also, for students who have been expelled, you can provide opportunities to help them complete their GED courses. And it's also important to ensure that they're welcoming to LGBTQ youth. It's also really important to pledge time and money from the district and administration to support these restorative practices, because in order to see real change, like restorative practices, they're not like overnight, the benefit to see them fully fleshed out, it takes years. Like it ranges from 3 to 5 years is what is observed in studies. And then also it's important to, again, review district expenditures to see if any appropriate or excess funds can be allocated to student services. And then another thing is promoting accessibility to supports and services. So making sure all students, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, like ensuring that they have access to these restorative alternatives. And then lastly, amplifying the voices of students and or youth as they advocate for equity. So for example, like for youth who do join the Elevate program, or like even on campus, like youth who do rise up to speak up about this, supporting them and amplifying their voices. Next slide, please. So all of this is to essentially envision a better future for our students by creating a safe and productive learning space for them to develop their social and emotional skills. And then it also decreases the rate at which students drop out from school, which has a direct impact on mitigating the school to prison pipeline. This also narrows the racial and social disparity gaps and eliminates stigma and discrimination towards individuals with substance use disorders. Next slide, please. And so if you have any questions and we run out of time, feel free to email us. I'm going to throw all of it in the chat, all of our emails in the chat. Next slide, please. And this is our social media, if you are interested. And that is it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Ali. We appreciate you ending the presentation. And I'd like to give a special thank you to our LGBTQ Center of Orange County for obviously the time and the effort in building the presentation for our guests. I can definitely see how passionate this group is about providing this information, and it was a wealth of knowledge. We really appreciate it to our three presenters. So thank you very much for being a part of our evening.